Dear students, welcome to the course of Architecture and Town Planning. I am your teacher Ravinder Kumar Khyani, Assistant Professor, Department of Architecture and Planning, NED University of Engineering and Technology, Karachi, Sindh, Pakistan. Today the topic of our discussion is on the theme Information Required, and we are going to discuss about the natural resources and economic resources for town planning. Natural resources and economic resources. What is meant by natural resources? I think you must know that natural resources are naturally occurring substances that are considered valuable in their relatively unmodified or natural form. A commodity is generally considered a natural resource when the primary activities associated with it are extraction and purification as opposed to creation. For instance, there is mining, which is where the extraction takes place, petroleum, where purification takes place, or fishing. It is not creation, but it is the extraction and purification. So these are also resources. The term natural resources was introduced to a broad audience by E.F. Shoemaker in his 1970s book, Small is Beautiful. I must recommend you to read this book. It's a very good book to understand about the natural resources. Now let's talk about the classification of natural resources. Natural resources are often classified into renewable and non-renewable resources. The renewable resources may be further categorized as unconditionally renewable and conditionally renewable. For example, the solar energy, the tidal or wind energy is known as unconditional renewable energy. And the fish forest products are known as conditionally renewable. Conditionally renewable resources will last indefinitely if not over-exploited, because the part of the resources that is used can be replaced through natural processes. So one must realize that natural resources are renewable if we are not going to over-exploit it. Then we must understand that we should have a sustainable use of renewable resources. The renewable resources can be used indefinitely if they are used sustainably or if not over harvested. These are the types of renewable energies and non-renewable energies. Once renewable resources are consumed at a rate that exceeds their natural rate of replacement, the standing stock will diminish and eventually run out. So we must be careful about the use of the renewable resources. The rate of sustainable use of a renewable resource is determined by the replacement rate and amount of standing stock of that resource. So this is very important that for sustainable use of renewable resources, we must have an understanding of not diminishing or overusing the existing resources. Now, what is the relationship of natural resources and town planning? In case of town planning, the understanding of natural resources is very important because the end product of any town planning exercise is the construction of new built-up structures on a virgin land as per future needs. The other outcome of town planning is the reconstruction of the existing old built-up structures to suit the need of present time. In both cases, there emerge major changes and transformations in the physical appearance and character of the existing urban context. These changes and transformations may occur in the form of large movements of soil, that is sand and stones, from one place to another to be used as a building material. For building materials, we extract stone from the quarries. and we can take the sand from the riverbeds. Grubbing of the natural vegetation and trees is also one of the activities from virgin land to construct buildings. This is also there that we just clear the natural vegetation from the site for constructing the building. These changes and transformation may cause various impacts such as change in the groundwater pattern and the bearing capacity of the soils. So as an engineer and architect, we must think about the natural resources, and it is used in the building construction practices and in town planning. Now let's talk about sustainable town planning. Furthermore, the town, cities and urban areas attracts large number of populations that live and work there and consume lot of natural resources such as oil and gas. Without oil and gas, we cannot survive. The large high-rise buildings also exist in urban context that requires a lot of building materials and natural resources and become the cause of urban heat islands. What is urban heat island? Urban heat island is like that when there are so many buildings constructed in the center of the city, the energy is the sunlight is reflected from building to building, and as there are hard surfaces, so heat increases. So in the center of the city, where the high density of the building is existing, the urban heat like island emerge and heat increases. As you go outside the city, as you can see in the graph, you find that there is a heat reduction. So in the center of the city, if the heat is of 30 degree, then in the outside of the city there will be 28 degree. The urban heat islands are where the temperature is higher, and the important thing is that it is higher in the overdeveloped areas. Additionally, in town planning, many mega construction projects are made that requires major changes in the ecology of the land, terrains, soils, vegetation, rivers, stormwater drains, coastal belt, etc. This change and transformation may be carefully analyzed through the initial environmental examination, environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, visual impact assessment, and landscape and visual impact assessment together. So what are these IEEE and EIA and SIA and VIA and LBSIA? Let's talk about them. These basically are the assessment methods so as town planning may be sustainable. Sustainable town planning. So first, let's look at the initial environmental examination. IEE is a preliminary attempt to evaluate environmental impacts in order to determine whether a full-scale environmental impact assessment is needed or not. And this is done on the different projects, building projects as well as town planning projects. It is also called the Initial Environmental Investigation or IEI or Partial EIA or Preliminary EIA. Then comes the Environmental Impact Assessment. The EIA can be defined as the analysis of biological, physical, social, and economic factors to determine the environmental and social consequences of a proposed development action. Because when we are developing a transport system or industry or mass transit, these are the development actions in town planning. The goal of EIA is to provide policymakers with the best available information in order to minimize economic costs and maximize the benefits associated with the proposed development or any physical development in a city or town planning. Furthermore, social impact assessment. The social impact assessment includes the processes of analyzing, monitoring, and managing the intended and unintended social consequences, both positive and negative, of planned interventions. For example, if you are making a policy or program or plan or project, it must have some social impacts or social consequences. And any social change processes involved by those interventions. Its primary purpose is to bring about a more sustainable and equitable biophysical and human environment. This technique is form of direct impact analysis used to assess how the costs and benefits of reforms are distributed among different stakeholders and over time. Then landscape and visual impact assessment. The landscape and visual impact assessment are two separate but closely related assessments. Landscape refers to the appearance of the land, including its shape, texture, and color. It also reflects the way these components combine to create specific patterns and pictures that are distinctive to certain areas. Landscape is not just visual phenomena, it relies on the several other features and influences that will have shaped its character. For example, the topography, geology, ecology, land management, and architecture all play a part in the formation of a landscape. Now, sustainable development and town planning. The town planning will be sustainable only when there occurs a sustainable development. Let's look at what is sustainable development.
Hi guys! Do you have time for a few quick questions? I see you're having a lot of fun, but do you ever stop and think if what you do is sustainable? And do you know what sustainable development means? Sustainable development is to make the world a better place for everyone now without destroying the possibilities for the next generations. If you wonder if something is sustainable, you can ask yourself, can we do this over and over again forever? Sustainable development means that we need to keep three things in mind at once: social progress, economic development, and climate and environment. First of all, we have to take care of our planet. We have many natural ecosystems that must be in balance in order for us to live here. The climate system is one of them. This system ensures that the temperature is correct and that the atmosphere emits exactly the right amount of solar energy. When we emit harmful greenhouse gases, such as CO2, we clog the atmosphere. This changes the temperatures on Earth, which again affects our development. How we produce and use energy is incredibly important. Oil and coal are examples of energy we may run out of. Water, wind, and sun, however, will always be here. Using the lasting sources of energy that renew themselves is good for the planet and can provide jobs for years to come. Economics. Almost everything we develop, buy, and trade starts with nature. The smarter we use our natural resources and the better systems we create for a fair distribution, the more sustainable we are. One way to contribute to a more uneven distribution is to be more aware of what we buy and how it is produced. A football is a good example. It travels far before it reaches the football players. First, the materials are made. Then, they print the logo somewhere else before a third country sews it all together. One single football sees the whole world before it reaches its goal. This journey ties us together. If we are to win the battle for a sustainable future, we have to play with fair rules that applies to everyone. Social progress. We humans are part of nature, but we're also important resources for the world. Just like water, the forest, and the sun, we have minds that can create the strangest and most creative things. But for us to be the best versions of ourselves, there are certain things that must be in order, like having equal opportunities to education, safety, food, and medicine. This provides greater opportunities for us as human beings, but also for the planet. We just have to think in new ways. These three must work together. That is sustainable development. And there is actually a plan for this. All the countries of the United Nations have agreed on a joint plan for sustainable development. But for the plan to work, we need to cooperate, and we need you to be on board. Are you with us?
So this is the question, that whether whatever town planning we are doing is sustainable or not. And for sustainable town planning, it is very important that natural resources should be properly used, and economic progress should be taking place, social progress should be taking place, and environmental control or environmental design should be appropriate. Only then the town planning will work as sustainable. After understanding the sustainable town planning, it is also important that we should stress on the natural resources use and why natural resource use matters in town planning. So let's look at this and why the natural resources are so significant for town planning.
Why managing our natural resources matters. Water, land, soils, food, air, minerals, and metals. Our whole civilization relies on them to survive. And yet, strong growth in the population, from 7 billion today to up to 9 billion by 2050, means increasing demand is depleting these vital resources. There is potential for serious scarcities in the years ahead. If current practices continue, water scarcity and contamination, desertification, air pollution, loss of biodiversity, and land degradation will be more critical in the years ahead. All of these eventually have an impact on human health. It's hard to find a balance. Forests, for example, are the habitat for 77% of globally threatened birds. The trade in their timber and other forest products is estimated at $330 billion a year. However, ecotourism generates $77 billion in the same period, and 60 million indigenous people depend on these forests, which also contribute to the livelihoods of 1.6 billion people worldwide. Ayo and May can see the impact resource use is having on the environment around them. They worry about what will happen to their communities when the resources are gone, and what will happen to the world in the near future if this keeps going. They can see how the current use and management of natural resources is affecting the environment around them, changing ecosystems, and impacting biodiversity. Therefore, they understand the need for urgent change and the importance of groups such as the International Resource Panel. Hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme, the IRP is made up of eminent scientists who study the global trends of natural resource use, the socio-economic and environmental impacts of these trends, and the opportunities we have for a more sustainable future. They try to answer the world's most critical resource questions in order to develop practical solutions for government policymakers, industry, and society. Because we are using more resources than the planet can provide or replenish, the IRP's aim is to steer us away from overconsumption, damaging production, waste, and ecological harm to a more prosperous and sustainable future. Ayo and May are relieved. They are glad that the IRP is around to support governments, industries, and society as they work to find a balance between economic growth and the well-being of the planet, breaking the link between natural resource use and harmful environmental impacts. They are also happy to see those in their community receive a sustainable source of income and that the well-being of their families is ensured.
So you have seen that as an engineer, architect, and planners, we must take care about the natural resources. In order to create built environment, we should not destroy the natural environment, and we should not use the natural resources so much that it may harm our life and health. If our health is not good in cities, then why to build such cities? Then the next important aspect is the economic resources and town planning. Because when we are going to develop a town, we require economic resources and how the money is being used in the city and how expenditure of the government is taking place. So that is very important. So economic resources are important for the just distribution, equitable distribution within the city. So let's talk about what are economic resources. Economic resources means natural, human, and capital resources that are used to produce goods and services. It is also called the factors of production. The factors of production are the resources employed to produce goods and services, that is land, labor, and capital. These three groups of resources that are used to make all goods and services. In relation to production, three questions are very important. What to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. For example, if we are going to provide housing to the people, then whether we are going to provide housing for the rich or elite or the people who afford it or middle income, or we are providing for the low income. And once we decide what to produce and how to produce housing for the low income, because majority people are low income, they cannot afford the housing. And for whom to produce, if we are producing the elite enclaves and elite housing and such kind of housing which is for the rich, it will be very easy to do it because there are people who are going to give the money, but for the poor people it will be very difficult. So economic resources use should be efficient. In addition, it's also important to understand that why goods and resources are related to town planning and how land, labor and capital are the significant elements of town planning. Whereas it may need a further explanation about economics as well as urban economics to understand the details about economic resources and its significance in town planning. Let's look at the global situation of economic resources and town planning for the people, because at the end of the day we are going to develop town planning or do plan the cities for the people. So what is the situation of people? We must understand that. Let's see what the situation of people.
By 2030, scientists predict there'll be 1 billion more people in the world. So where are they going to live? The greatest population expansions are expected to happen in African and Asian cities, many of which are already very overcrowded, so they can't go there. Two researchers in the States set out to build a map of potential places to put the next billion people. First, they ruled out regions with high water stress, land covered in ice, and places with unique species that need protecting. Then they excluded densely settled areas where there were more than 100 people per square kilometre. What they are left with are zones deemed suitable for sustainable development, some classed as highly sustainable and some as somewhat sustainable. But it isn't quite that simple. Large areas of Central Africa fit the bill, with lots of natural resources. But at the moment, these areas are poorly governed and there are few jobs. Another promising swathe of land is in South America. On one hand, the warm, moist climate could support crops like rice and maize, great for feeding lots of hungry mouths. On the other hand, nearby biodiversity hotspots like the Amazon basin need protecting. There are similar conservation concerns in species-rich northern Queensland, and finding suitable land isn't the only challenge. As recent refugee crises in the Middle East demonstrate, relocating people from their homelands to new shores is not easy, politically, emotionally, or practically. Also, the habitable zones on this map span multiple countries, and it's unclear how governments would work together to encourage migration there or to house people. There are other options, like creating yet more compact cities supplied with water from yet deeper wells or desalination plants, but some argue that this would be unsustainable in the long term. What is clear is that the next billion people will need to live somewhere, and urban planners, scientists and politicians will need to work together to plan where it's going to be.
So you have seen that how global the situation of the population is. That is the same situation with us. For example, our mega cities or large cities are increasing a lot because of the population in migration, and providing the housing to them and the education and health and all the facilities is very difficult. So let's talk about the economic resources, how they are being used, and what is the role of urban economics. Urban economics and town planning for the people. What is urban economics? Urban economics is broadly the economic study of urban areas, and it involves using the tools of economics to analyze urban issues such as crime, education, public transit, housing, and local government finance. Urban economics focuses on these spatial relationships to understand the economic motivation underlying the formation, functioning, and development of the cities. Economics is a study of allocation of scarce resources, and as all economic phenomena takes place within a geographical space, urban economics focuses on the allocation of resources across space in relation to urban areas. Other branches of economics ignore the spatial aspects of the decision making, that is the town planning. But urban economics focuses not only on the location decision of the firms, but also of the cities themselves, as they represent the centers of economic activity. Urban economics is divided into six related themes. First is the market forces in the development of cities. What is their role? The land use within the cities, how it is changing. The urban transportation, whether it is provided or not provided. The urban problems and public policy, how the government is dealing with urban problems. Then housing and public policy, because population is increased and we require the housing for the people. And local government expenditure and taxes. The local government's finances, how they are going to manage their cities. Let's talk about market forces in the development of cities. Market forces in the development of cities relates to how location decision of firms, institutions and households causes the development of cities. The location decisions of both firms, institutions and households create different size and economic structure of cities. Market forces also affect the social structure of cities and shape them in a different manner. Then land use within the metropolitan areas. Looking at the land use within metropolitan areas or major cities, the urban economists seek to analyze the spatial organization of activities within cities to explain observed pattern of land use, how it is changing and transforming. Considering the spatial organization of activities within cities, urban economics addresses questions in terms of what determines the price of land and why those prices vary across space. Because nowadays you can see the prices of the land is increasing a lot. And economic policy in urban areas is also important. Economic policy is often implemented at the urban level as public policy, and it relates to the urban problems such as poverty and the crime. It also seeks to answer the questions related to poverty and crime with economic guidance. For example, does the tendency for the poor to live close to one another make them even poorer or let them sustain socioeconomically? Urban transportation and urban economics. Urban transportation is the theme of urban economics because it affects land use patterns as transportation affects the relative accessibility of different sites. Issues that tie urban transportation to urban economics include deficit that most transit authorities have and the efficiency questions about proposed transportation developments such as mass transit railway, light rail and bus rapid transit system in megacities. Housing and public policy. Housing and public policy relate to urban economics as housing is a unique type of commodity because housing is immovable. When a household chooses a dwelling, it is also choosing a location and that location remains for a long time. For example, urban economists analyze the location choices of household in conjunction with the market effects of housing policies on people because market forces led the people to live at one place or another because it is the basis of the affordability of the people to make choice of their housing and other you can say spaces. Then government expenditure and taxes in the urban economics. The final theme of local government expenditure and taxes relates to urban economics as it analyzes the efficiency of the fragmented local governments residing in metropolitan areas. For example, primate cities collect and contribute high taxes for economics and finance of local, provincial and federal government, but remain unable to get government expenditure on transport and infrastructure. Conclusively, for every kind of town planning, three questions are very important. What to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. The answer to these questions is a key factor to understand the whole dynamics of economic resources in town planning. Because it has clearly led to appropriate use of economic resources of city in all developed countries. And here we have to look at this issue by doing the appropriate town planning. Finally, I end my lecture here. These are the references for the people who I have studied their books and prepared this lecture. Thank you very much for listening to the lecture. For detailed lecture notes, visit my blog www.townplanninglectures.blogspot.com.